So welcome back, everyone. My name is Zsolt Darvas. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I have the great honor and pleasure to chair our coming discussion on the structural determinants of inequality. And first of all, I'm very pleased that we have really an excellent group of people talking to us. I have a bad news that unfortunately the flight of Anna Ekström, the Swedish Minister for Upper Secondary Education, has been cancelled this morning. So unfortunately she cannot join us. But luckily the other three speakers were able to make it. So let me briefly introduce them, and after that I will briefly introduce the topic. So in alphabetic order, Reiner Hoffmann is the president of the German Trade Union Confederation. He spent most of his professional life working for various European and German trade union institutions. Nathalie Moll is the director of the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, which represents 33 national associations and 40 leading pharmaceutical companies. So altogether their association are representative of more than 1,900 companies. And before that he spent most of her professional life working for the biotech industry. And last but not least, we are very pleased to welcome Marianne Thyssen, European Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs, Skills and Labour Mobility, who has been at the Commission since 2014. And before that, he was a member of the European Parliament for a very long time, from 1991 till 2014. And during that period, she was also a vice chair of the Economic Committee. Now, so we have really an excellent set of speakers coming from different institutions, and therefore we'll bring different perspectives to our discussion today on inequalities or on the structural determinants of inequalities. And certainly the first question which can come to our mind are what possible determinants of inequality, and now we mostly speak about income inequality, wealth inequality, but we might also speak about gender inequality, health and education-related issues. And recently the debate on these various kinds of inequalities has been intensified, both in the policy debate, but also in the academic debate. Many excellent books and academic publications have been recently published. So one question, what could drive all of these inequalities? And there are a couple of standard possible explanations. I hope our panelists will shed light whether they are valid or not. One is technology. I mean, even in the previous session on the future of industry, basically all three panelists and also Reiner Fugler's emphasized that technological change has major implications on the organization of work and also have implications on labor and employment and unemployment. So certainly one possible explanation could be technology. Another possible explanation could be globalization. Why it's generally believed, I believe that, for example, trade globalization brings many benefits to both partners on the trade, but on the other hand, it also has been established in the literature that, for example, imports from emerging countries might reduce the wages and employment of especially low-skilled workers in advanced countries, and certainly those low-skilled workers in advanced countries might find it more difficult to find another job. Financial globalization might also be a factor. I mean, in some financial sectors, clearly the industry has been concentrated a lot. Wages increased very rapidly in those sectors, so that could be also an explanation. Another explanation which perhaps Reiner Hoffmann may emphasize is the changes in labor market institutions. What we have seen is that in recent decades, labor markets became much more flexible and the role of trade unions declined globally. And certainly if the bargaining power of labor is diminished, that might also possibly lead, I mean, I hope we will get answer to that question, but possibly it might also lead to increasing inequalities if labor cannot exercise any more stronger pressure on wage increases. And lastly, also economic policies might have a role on inequalities. For example, again, in the past decades, redistribution or the progressivity of the tax system generally declined in many advanced countries. Top income tax rates in a number of countries fell to very rather low level compared to earlier values. So also various tax and other redistributive policies might have led to increasing inequalities. But when we talk about increasing inequalities, I think we also have to say a good news, namely that income inequalities in Europe are generally much smaller than in a number of other parts of the world. I mean, if you compare Europe, let's say, to the United States or China or countries in Latin America, what we see is that income inequality is much lower than on those regions. So I think that's a very good news which has to be emphasized. It shouldn't be surprising because as Angela Merkel said sometime, Europe has 7% of world population, but almost half of world welfare spending. Now, if we spend so much on welfare-related issues, then it shouldn't be that surprising that income inequality is generally lower than in a number of other parts of the world. But certainly that's a good news. Another good news, which a conclusion we reached in a paper with Günther and Wolf, is that if you look at the European Union as a whole, so we're not looking country by country, but the whole union of the 28 member states, then from about 1995 up to 2007 and 2008, there was a steady decline in the European Union-wide income inequality. It was largely driven by income convergence across different regions, which I think is also a good news to be mentioned. Now, having said that, there are also a number of differences and divergences within European Union countries, and perhaps Commissioner Thyssen will also mention that. So without further ado, let me invite our speakers to the podium. We ask them to offer some brief initial remarks, about 10 minutes. After that, we will have a discussion among the panelists, and then I will open the floor for questions and comments to all of you. Now, in general, we used to speak in alphabetic order, but this time I asked Commissioner Thyssen to be the first speaker because she will bring a pan-European overview and also discuss various European Union policies. So, Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to be here to take part in such an important debate. Talking inequality is an imperative for the European Union, for economic, for social, and for political reasons. First, the economic argument: reducing inequality is good for growth, competitiveness, and ensures our welfare systems remain sustainable. Second, there is a social argument. Everyone must participate in the labour market and in society. No one should be left behind. And third, there is a political imperative. Because of the economic crisis, people feel left behind. They want pains and gains to be distributed equally. On top of this, we are in the midst of an economic and societal transition. Globalization and digitalization are changing the way we work and live. People see the world changing fast, and they no longer feel the control. The result is disillusionment in politics and society, and the rise of populism, extremism, and nationalism. Therefore, it is important to understand the impact and the origin of inequalities and to see how we can best respond. we need to make a distinction. There is inequality between countries and inequality within countries. Let me first spend a word on the inequalities between countries. The creation of a level playing field through the harmonization of goods, services and capital, and the coordination of labour markets, our common currency, and structural and cohesion policies all contribute to the decrease of inequalities among countries in Europe. The European Union has been dubbed a convergence machine. This function is extremely important. The single market must benefit all member states, not just a few. This is essential for its continued acceptance. The crisis partly halted this process of convergence between member states. In particular, employment and unemployment diverged strongly as a result. However, the convergence engine is now starting again. Both household disposable income and GDP per capita between the EU countries show clear signs of convergence. On the other hand, there has been some increase in inequality within countries. Among the European member states, the incomes of the richest 20% are on average more than 5 times higher than those of the poorest 20%. It was stable or even reducing until the crisis, but it has been increasing since, at least on average. And the second but, it is not the case for all member states. But to tackle inequality in earnest, we must first understand its sources. Firstly, market income, basically pre-tax income, has become more unequal in European countries due to globalization, technological progress, and also changes in household structures. Globalization, for example, impacts jobs when production moves from high to low income countries. Likewise, technological progress reduces the demand for middle-skilled and also polarizes earning distribution. Finally, changes in household structure, such as more single-person or single-parents households, may contribute to increasing income inequality. And then we have the redistribution policies. In social market economies, taxes and social transfers mediate market income, but in some cases, the crisis has limited the ability of the welfare state to protect individuals. In my view, the policy response must be multidimensional. Firstly, it must aim to reduce inequalities in income, especially by focusing on work. At European level, we are inventing on different fronts. Last year, we adopted the skills agenda. With the right skills, people are better equipped for good quality jobs. Raising skill levels and preparing our people for the jobs of tomorrow is the first way to address inequality in earnings. In April this year, the Commission launched the European Pillar of Social Rights, addressing inequality features strongly in its principles and rights. And this pillar that should guide us as a compass to adapt our institutions to the new world of work and the new society, but also to have more convergence, this pillar is not only words. It is accompanied by concrete initiatives that aim to foster convergence and address inequalities. For instance, our work-life balance proposal will give more flexibility and better protection to parents and carers, and better positions for women on the labour market. And we are consulting social partners on extending core labour rights and social protection to all workers, including workers in the gig economy. I could elaborate further on these initiatives if you are interested. Moreover, we must create jobs. Wherever possible, this Commission takes steps to boost job creation, for example, via the EFSI, the European Fund for Strategic Investments, the Capital Markets Union, the Digital Single Market, and so more, we also strongly push for reforms that support growth in member states through the European semester. Secondly, we need to look at the tax and benefits systems. The relaunch of the CCCTB, the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, and the initiatives on tax transparency should contribute to ensuring a fair distribution of the products of growth, income, and wealth in our member states. In this area, member states have the main competence, but both before and after taxes and social benefits. It is up to member states and to their political choices how ambitious they want to be to address inequalities. Ladies and gentlemen, the principles and rights of the European Pillar of Social Rights clearly aim to serve an inspiration and guidance for member states. In full respect of subsidiarity and competences, and those may acquire those principles, they may acquire legal value and become enforceable, but only through national and or European legislation and policies or social partner agreements. To guide this process of convergence, the Commission will work with benchmarks and monitor progress through the European semester. That is why the interinstitutional proclamation of the European Pillar of Social Rights would represent a political commitment at highest level. I hope that we can succeed in that objective before the end of this year. And the Commission would then monitor the implementation of the pillar at national level through the European Semester of Economic Coordination. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what I am working on now to achieve before the end of the year. Building on the momentum of the European Pillar of Social Rights, we have an opportunity to move national and European policies more consistently to address inequalities. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for this very clear presentation in which you described why tackling inequalities are important, what are the situation between and also within countries, and also discussing the various European Union policies for which you personally work a lot to make them succeed. And we are, first of all, very grateful for all your hard work. I just would have one follow-up question, and it is related whether there is a goal for reducing income inequalities. Because, I mean, if I look at, for example, the Europe 2020 agenda, I mean, it aims to tackle poverty, and I think many of the programs you mentioned, the skills agenda and so on, job creation are especially helpful for reducing poverty, and I think that's very, very clear that there is a strong political agreement on tackling poverty. But my question is that, what's your feeling that how strong the political view among member states to address income inequality, which means not just tackling the bottom part of the income distribution, but also addressing the higher part. For example, a number of countries that are flat tax rates, which is certainly, I mean, benefiting those who are richer and having higher income.
Thank you for this question. Yeah, we know that inequality is evaluating in a different way in different member states, not only that it's going up or going down, higher or lower, but what we see in those member states where inequality was on the rise last years, in some member states it is because there is a more unequal distribution. I mean, the share of the lower part is becoming smaller. In some other member states, you see that the share of the lower part, the poorest 20%, is not becoming lower, but the richest part, the richest 20%, are becoming far more rich. So this is, it's not happening in the same way everywhere. And I think it's up to member states, because they have, of course, the instruments in their hand to see how they tax. But social benefits and taxation are the two main elements in the hands of member states to organize a redistribution. We have the income, the disposable income before tax, but then you have to look what you do with it. And this is clearly the prerogative of member states to organize their tax system, to see how they finance the needs of their public finances, of their public policy. But of course, we give them incentives and we make remarks in country reports if we see that inequality is very high. And if you ask me personally what I think about flat rates on taxes, on income taxes, if I would be responsible, I would not go for that choice. I think people that don't earn that much, you cannot say, well, on everything you earn, you pay just the same flat rate as those who are really very rich. I think this is not the right signal if you care about inequalities, not only about inequalities, but also, well, as such, I mean, one has more than the other, okay, but if this is growing too far apart, you lose the cohesion in your society. You have, even if the lowest part is not really poor, they feel poor and they feel abandoned and they are not happy anymore. And as I said in my introduction, this is feeding extremism, populism, and also nationalism, because it's then the other that is the cause of. And this is all that is not good for cohesion in society. And I'm for a big middle class and a good cohesion in society. I think it makes people more happy and it gives better chances in life for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I may just mention that I very much share your view. So, Mr. Hoffman, if I may ask you to give your initial remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, also from my side, a very warm welcome and many thanks for the invitation. I think it's an important issue we are talking about, and if I look from a European perspective, having in mind a little bit historical perspective, that after World War I and World War II, Europe has been the most innovative invention we ever have faced in Europe. And if I look to the aggregated prosperity, Europe is a rich part at our from a global perspective. But I think nowadays Europe is not only at a crossroad, Europe is really at risk if there will be no significant policy change also to combat inequality. And the reasons for inequality, I think, are a number of reasons. It would be taking too much time to go into depth to analyze them, but let me mention only two aspects from a European perspective, which I think is extremely important. The trade unions in Europe have been always a strong supporter of European integration. We have even been a strong supporter of the monetary union, but this was never without conditions. And what we are facing and what we have experienced after the international financial market crisis, starting with the Lehman Brothers in the United States, we have been faced over decades with a neoliberal policy approach, which has led to the result that inequality has been on the rise and that financial markets have taken over, also to steer our economies and to steer our company policies. And the second, and we have learned some lessons, and I think it was extremely important that Europe has been, to some extent, in a position to act in a unified manner. But what we have done on the re-regulation of financial markets has been, to my opinion, and this has been shared by many economists, not ambitious enough. We have still a number of huge insecurity, and we are not really sure when they will come up, and we will be faced with another big financial crisis. The second thing is, and also in relation to the monetary union, as I said, we have been a strong supporter, but there are a number of construction mistakes because a monetary union cannot be successful if we have not at the same time something like a political union, and if we at least cannot have a European monetary policy without at least harmonization in taxation policies of the member states, and having not, and this is also addressed to some extent certainly to the unions, having also more European coordinated wage policy. So these are two big challenges we are facing from a European perspective. And Marianne Thyssen, I think, has rightly said that we are faced with inequality inside the member states, but also between the member states. And European integration, one objective we have always supported was the convergence of the European member states. And we have been successful for a number of years, but this process has been stopped and has been reversed. And if I look to the situation in Germany, I will mention only two major issues which are responsible for the increase of inequality. There has been, over the last decades, redistribution from the bottom to the top. The expansion of the low-wage sector in Germany is really in an unacceptable manner. Germany, as one of the richest countries in Europe, has the highest low-wage labor market, has the highest proportion of low-wage earners in the labor market. More than 22% are earning less than 60% of the median income. And this is in Germany below €9.60 an hour. This has to do with labor market reforms, and many politicians have always looked to Germany, what we have done with our Agenda 2010, but that we have an increase in inequality is a result of a wrong labor market policy and a deregulation of our labor markets. We have an increase not only in atypical work. I think we have to be ready to face the dramatic changes inside the labor markets, driven by globalization, driven by technological innovations, driven by digitalization. So we will face these new forms of labor. But we have to make a distinction between atypical work and precarious work. And also typical workers are working under precarious conditions, not only atypical workers. Atypical workers can have a relatively high and decent income, but the experiences we have, most of them are living under precarious conditions. So to reorganize our labor market is one of the big challenges to combat inequality, and this cannot be done any longer at the national level. This has to be done at the European level, and I support the Commission in their ambition on the pillar of social rights, but I see that most of the member states are not really ready to elaborate a real European labor market strategy with significant labor rights, and we see all the disaster over the last couple of months if it comes to the Posting of Workers Directive. We have to be much more ambitious, and I see that some member states are not ready to go this way. The second important aspect is that we have, and what we can do as trade unions is very limited. It's limited in so far that we can't combat inequality only by collective bargaining policies. We have to see also what kind of redistribution has taken place by a number of tax reforms or tax gifts we have been faced in Germany over the last couple of years. The reduction of income tax for very high incomes, the suspension in Germany of property taxes, and the reduction of company taxes, and a quite weak inheritance taxation in Germany. These are the two key drivers. And I think this will be, as Marianne Thyssen said, a big challenge for social cohesion in Europe. Social cohesion is at the risk, and it's not only social cohesion. I think if you look to the growing political forces which are facing or which are looking for renationalization, which are to some extent really against further European integration, this is also a threat to democracy. And if we are realizing that Europe is not only at the crossroads, that we are really at risk, we need a significant policy change. Otherwise, I'm quite skeptical, and that's not my nature, I'm quite skeptical that Europe will be successful in the forthcoming years if we are not succeeding our fight against inequality.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoffman, also for this very clear, but also presentation in which you make some very strong statements, if I can say. Certainly, it was intentional. Now, so let me come with two questions to you. So one regarding the German labor market reform, about which you said that it was a mistake. You probably referred to these reforms in the early 2000s. Now, as you also mentioned that these reforms are generally thought by many people as success, because if you look at, for example, unemployment rates in Germany, it's at historical lows. And certainly, I mean, I think unemployment is possibly the worst social situation that someone can have. So if you could elaborate a little bit on what went wrong with these reforms, and for example, what are the other countries of Europe which were able to manage the labor market more or better. The second issue is related to what you mentioned about redistributive policies. I tend to agree with many of what you said. You talked about reduction of top income taxes. You talk about corporate taxes and inheritance taxes. Now, my question to you is that in Europe, would it be possible for one country to go ahead with all of this taxation, or would there be need a European-wide coordination at least? Because, you know, certainly if you make a country to a tax haven and another country you increase top income taxes, then many individuals and companies would change their location. So one issue is about Europe, but the second is more general in a globalized world. How would you see the impact of a much more redistributive policies in Europe, whether Europe would be able to survive the competition coming from the rest of the world?
Concerning your first question, I will raise one very specific aspect, which is not only the case for Germany. If I look also to southern European countries, not so much in the Benelux countries or in the Scandinavian countries. In the late 90s, early 2000s, in Germany we had a coverage rate by collective agreements of around 75 up to 80%. That means 75% of workers have been sheltered by collective agreements. This has declined to, this has something to do with the German reunification, certainly, and has been declined in average in Germany down to 50%. Only 50% in Germany are covered by collective agreements. And those who are sheltered by collective agreements earning 15 up to 25% more than people without the shelter of collective agreements. They have shorter working hours, they have more holidays, and certainly much better working conditions, regulated by collective agreements. So, and if I see the development, for example, in UK is down to a coverage of 25%, even below Germany. And if I look the consequences of the austerity policies in the southern European countries, the collective bargaining autonomy has been diminished based on European policies and the wrong medicine, which came mainly from Berlin, and this has a name, the German finance minister. To be clear and tough. So that leads to the second point of your question, what we have to do. We have, the European Trade Union Confederation makes huge effort in a campaign that we are saying Europe needs a pay rise. And this is what is one strong response to combat inequality. But this will be not enough, because we have, and this is one of the construction mistakes of the monetary union, we have competition on lowering our taxations in Europe. And what we need at least is a harmonization of corporation taxes in Europe. This is nothing new. But concerning your question, I would prefer if we could do this in the monetary union as a whole. But we know that a number of member states are entirely against any harmonization of our taxation system. So this, if we will come over this, and if not, if I'm quite critical what Macron is doing in France on the labor market reforms. I've been in touch with my French unions, but we are in one specific aspect on the same direction. If France will fail, this will also be a failure for Europe, because on the European perspective and the proposals of Macron to have a European fiscal capacity, to have a European finance minister, to have a much stronger approach on European investment, which has been mentioned by Marianne Thyssen, I think this could lead in the same direction. But we need a strong alliance between France and Germany. This would be a starting point, and then to see which other member states will be ready to follow this track, which would be an entirely different track than to continue with austerity policies, which will not lead to solutions, which will lead to the risk that union could become a failure in the forthcoming years.
Thank you very much. Before I will give the floor to Nathalie, let me ask the Commissioner to respond briefly, because you also made a statement that wrong European Union policies were at least partly responsible for the deterioration in working conditions of number of workers in a country, and also possibly the reduction in the number of people covered by trade unions. So, Commissioner, would you like to respond?
Well, I think there are many questions in one. It's about austerity policy, it's about problems for the social dialogue in member states, also at European level, and it's about how are we deepening the EMU, what you also touched upon in your speech, in your introductory words. I think on austerity, I agree that what we call the six-pack and all the measures that were taken during the crisis, in the beginning of the crisis, that were urgency measures at the time, that they are and were very strict. On the other hand, I think that's my personal opinion, that after 7 years, we are applying all these rules now during 7 years, that it's time for a review to look, are they still fit for purpose? We have the hardest part of the crisis behind us, still we are in the aftermath of the crisis, we have to be prudent, but are they still the best possible things we can have? I think it's worth to have a review, and I don't say I want to change them, but to look in depth whether it's still the best possible thing that we can do. But having said this, if I look at the attitude and the behavior of this European Commission, we said, yeah, there is this six-pack and so on. All those rules are also designed with some elements of flexibility, and we use them. We made a decision on the use of the flexibility possibilities in January 15, and also the way we handle the dossiers. Our position, our starting point is, we are not there as a Commission to punish Member States. We are there to support them and to push them, to stimulate them to go into the right direction. And this is what we do in the country reports and in our country-specific recommendations, and when we have to judge whether they fulfill criteria and conditions. But anyway, I think we also must realize that public money is scarce, and that to have also a sustainable organization of your society, also an inclusive society, that we need sustainable public finances, and that we may not forget the intergenerational perspective. We cannot just accumulate debt to pass it through to the next generation, so we have to be careful. Now, destroying social dialogue, allow me not to look backward, but to look forward. And one of the first things, you know it very well because you were there and we talked a lot about that, was this Commission said in the beginning of the mandate also, and really with a big support and the personal commitment of the President of this Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, we want to relaunch the social dialogue. And we do what we can there. Not only with this high-level conference in 15, but we decided and are working together on first giving at national level and at European level more impact of social partners. In the semester, for instance, before we come with our annual growth survey document, we consult social partners at European level. We enlarged the process to have more time for it. At Member States, we ask Member States, we push them to have consultation of their social partners before they come with their reform programs. We have also what we call our semester desks in the Member States. There are direct contacts of people that are there in the name, working in the name of the Commission, and we have direct contacts on a frequent basis, at least I can say, with social partners in the Member States. And we promised, and we are working on capacity building for social partners, because Germany has a tradition. You mentioned Benelux Member States, they have a tradition. Other Member States in Europe have a tradition of social dialogue, bargaining, have good social partners. But we have also Member States where there is a lack of capacity. And this is a very important point, and we are also working on that. Now, what can we do? What do we have to do more for future? We have to look where we are. Europe is becoming smaller. We think we are big, we have something to say, we are still an economic power, but we have to organize us to adapt our systems to the new world of work and the new society and so on, to be competitive also in the future, but also to leave nobody behind. It's a double challenge we have. It's to see that our enterprises can be competitive, but we have to do it in such a way that we have all our people on board and that we create a good society also still for all the people, that everybody has equal opportunities or good opportunities to come to the labor market, to have education, to build up their skills, that they all can have good working conditions, and that there is social protection for all. And this means modern social protection, accessible for all, also the gig economy workers. And it's not just to protect and to distribute benefits, no, it is to help them to be reskilled, to set their feet again on the labor market. And this is what we try to do under this social pillar. I think if we look at the whole picture, the economic and monetary union, six-pack, two-pack, the rules on the public finances, the banking, social, we have to deepen, and this exercise is going on, we have to deepen the economic and monetary union. We need more convergence, we have to set steps further. We are developing that in the reflection papers. And personally, I'm in favor of an own European budget, own means. But to use them, and we can use them also for social objectives, we need more convergence. And there we are again. How are we going to grow more to each other and not further apart? So we need more harmonization. And this is a step, yeah. When we have no competences to legislate, we use benchmarking. And we hope to convince member states. I see a positive attitude from member states towards the European pillar, and we from our side will do what we can, also in the use of our funds, to stimulate member states to do it. On taxes, we cannot harmonize. It's really set, it's also jurisprudence, but it's clearly set in the treaty that this competence belongs to the member states. But having said this, CCCTB is just at the board of what you can and what you can't. I'm really in favor of that, and I think this will really be an important step to help us. We had already a proposal in the last period. I was happy to be the rapporteur in the Parliament. I was very ambitious, but in the Council it was blocked. Now my colleague Pierre Moscovici, with the support of the whole Commission, launched a new proposal, and I think this is significant, because you don't just relaunch something if you don't believe that you have a chance. I think, meanwhile, the last years we see in Europe, but also around Europe, that one does not accept anymore tax avoidance, tax evasion and so on, and that we need new rules. And I hope that CCCTB can help us also on that fight. But it's not easy. And there you are totally right. It's not easy to convince all the member states. We continue to work to do it and to show them why it's necessary. And that it's not the one against the other, and you are taking our competitive advantage away, and you work for the West and not for the East. Let's stop this talk about divide, East-West and so on. We are 27 member states, 28 still. We have to work together. It's in the interest of every member state separately and of all the citizens. It is about our future, and we will build it together. This means all the member states and together with social partners, or this future will not be as bright as we could have had it. Sorry for being so long, but it's straight of my heart.
Very, very important. No, just very, very briefly.
Very, very brief. And I can't agree more that the intention of the President of the European Commission had huge expectations to strengthen the social dialogue. But with social dialogue, it is as it is with tango. You need two. And what the employers are doing at national level, and especially Business Europe at the European level, is to avoid any kind of a significant social dialogue. It's purely voluntary, it's drafting nice paper without substance, but coming not to the consequence to address the real issues. And so long as the employers are not changing their strategy, we will be not able to overcome the crisis.
Now, thank you. I'm sure we will come back to these issues of social dialogue in the question and answer session. But now let me ask Nathalie Moll, and let me just say a few words that our idea to invite Anna Ekström, Minister of Education, and Nathalie Moll from a pharmaceutical industry is that inequalities have two major aspects. One is related to education, and the other is related to healthcare. As probably many of you know, poorer people tend to live, much shorter lives than richer people. So indeed, health and health outcomes and access to quality healthcare is also a major issue in the inequality debate. So, Nathalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zsolt, for putting me into context, because I felt a little bit like the odd one out. But it's a pleasure to be here this morning, and it's extremely encouraging to see so many people in the room concerned and interested about the most important issue for everybody, inequality, because being inclusive and having everybody at the same level with the same access, not only to education, labour market, but also to health is extremely important if we want a growing economy, but a healthy economy and a cohesive society that resists divisions and other threats. So unsurprisingly, I would really be talking about health. Health is a prerequisite for a prosperous society, for growth, and of course also for individual citizens' ability to take part in society. Unhealthy people cannot get education or work or participate in growth in any way. And equal access to healthcare services and medicines and effective prevention is a very important factor to achieve equality also in other aspects. Normally, for those who know me, and there are a few in the room, I would not really follow a written trace, but I would talk more conceptually. But I think in inequality there's a part that's very conceptual, but there's a part that's very important and very factual. So I have a few facts, and so I apologize if I'll be looking at my sheet from time to time, which is not what I usually do. What is concerning in such a fundamental right like health is that there do remain inequalities, not only between countries, as I'll explain with a few examples, but also even within countries and within regions and capitals and so on. If we look at a number like the life expectancy in France, it's about 83 years in France, and Spain and Italy, compared to 75 years in Romania and Bulgaria. That's an enormous gap just there in our neighbourhood, really. We also know that several of the newer EU countries, and I don't want to make the East-West divide, Commissioner, but maybe for historical reasons when it comes to health outcomes, are less advanced, and it's due to different factors. It could be insufficient expenditure in healthcare, public health. It could be outdated healthcare systems that rely more on hospitals rather than primary care and community care. Also slower uptake of innovative technologies, not just in healthcare, but also in hospitals. And incomplete health coverage, insurance, high co-payments. There are still 4 EU countries that have about 10% of their population that is not regularly covered by healthcare costs. That's enormously important and something we never think in Europe. We always compare ourselves to the US and think that we're in a good place, but actually maybe not all of us are in a good place in that sense. Many of these issues are also recognized by the European Commission within the European semester process, and with recommendations to individual countries to spend more in healthcare, which is a rare recommendation from the European Commission. But it really is fundamental for these countries who have a need to progress in many of these areas to be able, even in the fiscal perspective of the European semester, to invest more in their health framework to also gain long-term financial sustainability. I was saying there's also inequality within countries, which is extremely concerning as well, and harder to explain, if you like, from a perspective of different levels of healthcare expenditure. It's a different, and we'll go into examples, but also what do you do about it? Because I think, as one of the previous speakers mentioned, it's interesting to know the reasons, but we want to move forward and find solutions as well. So there's a report analyzing data from 2008 to 2010 that showed that premature mortality from heart failure was 24% lower than the national average in Paris, whereas it was 54% above the national average in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, where I did my Erasmus. That's an enormous, so 24% lower than the national average and 54% higher than the national average. That's an enormous discrepancy in regions that are quite close to each other, in fact, in France, if you look at the map. The British have a name for this, apparently, the postcode lottery. So where your postcode determines your average life expectancy and risk of dying of different diseases. So although some differences can be attributed to external factors such as environmental, societal factors, lifestyle factors, there are also important differences on how healthcare providers deliver care in these different parts. And what really makes a difference in this kind of discussion is what can you measure? Because these are numbers, but how can you measure the way healthcare is being provided, as well as the outcomes, and what do you do with this data in order to encourage change. Since our speaker from Sweden is not here, I'm glad I have a Swedish example, so at least we bring a little bit of Sweden here today. Even in a country like Sweden, there are regional differences in terms of screening and diagnosis. For example, in the area of cancer, where there are medicines available for patients in some parts of Sweden, as well as treatments, and others not. This translates in differences in varying health outcomes. So again, an example, for the 3-year survival rate in lung cancer, so how many patients can survive with treatment for lung cancer, is 18.6% in the region, in one of the regions in Sweden, and 26.6% in Stockholm. So there's a difference of about more than 1/3 live longer in Stockholm if you have this disease and you're treated than if you're treated for the same disease in a region which is not Stockholm. And that's I would say, very important inequality in such a fundamental field as healthcare, which should be. The other particularity about Sweden is that they're very good at collecting data, and they've made that data public. They collect data on health outcomes, and this has a lot of benefits. You can compare health outcomes between regions, just like I mentioned, and also between providers. So you can start analyzing the causes and the differences between this data and learn from best practices, which is a little bit what was mentioned also before. Once you publish best practice, maybe when you can't impose things, publishing best practices encourages improvements. But also by making the data public, you suddenly stimulate the attention, I'm going to say, of citizens and patients. And if the patients can use comparative data, they might choose their providers differently, and they might choose where to go and get treatment. And that has shown, since the data has been published, so collected and published in 2006 in Sweden, that all regions have improved their healthcare outcomes, so the result of their care, but the worst performing regions have improved the most and almost caught up with the best regions. So you really can see how transparency and information and data can help relieve inequality by boosting best practices. Using data on health outcomes, so on results, to improve healthcare services is not only good for patients, but it's also good for financial sustainability of the healthcare systems, which is always a big concern for member states, of course. The OECD estimates that around 20 to 30% of healthcare expenditure is wasted. A lot of this waste that the OECD calls low-value care means that healthcare products and services do not give the optimal value for the money that was spent, or maybe no value. So one example could be knee and hip replacements. In some regions, in many cases, they don't actually bring measurable results for the patients, but they're still used, and they're an expensive procedure. So comparable data on healthcare outcomes can therefore really guide the healthcare systems, so the whole, or governments, if you like, in investing their resources in the right things that will help even out health inequalities, even in a tight budgetary situation. And the EU has a really important role to play in this. They obviously cannot they cannot tell member states to invest healthcare in one way or the other, because that is a member state competence, but they can encourage, I think, member states to use the right tools for collecting, comparing and analyzing health data for these and other purposes. And that's something that maybe in the digital strategy can also be encouraged. I like to end with good news. I'm a little bit like Zsolt, I'm a bit of an optimist, and I also try. I think another area that struck me in terms of inequality is inequality between diseases. So one area where I think the European Commission has been outstandingly successful is in picking up areas of completely neglected attention, like rare diseases, so diseases that affect 5 in 10,000 people. So you can imagine 5 in 10,000 people. Sometimes in a country there'll be maybe 100 patients who suffer from this disease. And where very little investment of industry had occurred, because first of all the disease is very difficult to understand. Usually it's genetically based, it's chronic, it affects children. It takes about 3 years to diagnose today, and 10, 15 years ago it was even longer. So realizing the unfairness, if you like, the inequality of these patients who didn't have any treatments, and creating a framework in order for there to be the correct incentives for industry to invest and develop treatments. So The Commission was the first region in the world to develop a regulation in 2000. It's not often that regulations boost developments, but this was the case. In 2000 on orphan medicinal products. And if before 2000 there were 8 treatments, today, so not that many, 15 years later or 17 years later, there are 132 treatments on the market. So imagine the difference that that makes. That doesn't mean that there are still 600 to 700 diseases that haven't been tackled, so we still have a lot of work to do. But there are ways in which, even from a European perspective, you can make a big difference in inequality. The same would be with children. Medicines for children, usually there were no ways to develop medicines specifically for children. And again, the Commission came with a legislation recently that, if you like, forced but encouraged industry with incentives to develop medicines or work out the dosage of medicines that would be specifically useful for children. And that has really worked. I mean, it's when you create the right incentives, you can also help level out inequalities in a way. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. We have a lot of products in development. I do believe, though, in the dialogue that was mentioned before, not only between trade unions and governments, but also in general when we're facing inequalities. It's such a wide spectrum of inequalities: education, income, access to labor, health. A really balanced and informed dialogue is the only way to go forward, and the pharmaceutical industry would love to be part of that conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, for this really excellent overview and citing some facts which really, really struck my mind. For example, what you mentioned for France, the differences between life expectancy within certain regions, or for Sweden, the successful treatment of lung cancer is really shocking, if I can say, because I would have thought that these two countries have relatively well developed healthcare systems, and so large regional differences is really shocking. Now, let me have one question regarding the data. Again, it was very interesting to learn from you that when in Sweden they published the data on the success of various treatments, then practically all regions and providers improved, but especially those who were the worst. And my question is that what prohibits the publication of such data? So is it a government decision in other countries not to do that, and what, for example, business associations like yours can do? I mean, I guess also you have access to many different kinds of data, whether you can also help the access to such data in the absence of a government policy on that.
Data is, yes, it's always an interesting topic. I think what prevents majorly is the capacity for member states to collect and even process the data. So you will have very few countries in Europe today who have a patient registry that covers the patient wherever he goes. So a hospital will have a registry for their patients, but then if the patient gets something else somewhere else, it will not be connected. So the collection of that data and the capacity to analyze it and turn it into something meaningful is, I would say, the major obstacle. And all this work that has been happening around data, data has a role in everything, right? But I think we should also prioritize where we need the data the most. And this would, for me, healthcare outcomes, so the results of healthcare is, for me, a priority of where data should be collected, analyzed, and shared. I don't think there would be any issues in sharing it, because it would be a government or institutional activity. We don't follow patients until the end, right? So we do the clinical trials, but we can't actually liaise with the patient once they're taking the treatment. So the industry couldn't find out what the outcomes of the treatments are in real world evidence situations. We would like to, and we really much encourage member states to work on real world evidence or on following the progression of the disease as the healthcare tools are set in place. And I can only think that it can be beneficial for everybody, really.
Thank you very much. Let's hope that some people will hear your suggestions. Now, I think it's time to open the floor for questions and comments. So anyone who would like to ask a question and make a comment, please raise your hand. My colleagues will move around and give you a microphone. I would like to ask each of you to briefly introduce yourself, and also in your question or comment, try to be brief. Perhaps we will collect a few questions, and then I give the floor to the panelists to respond to the various questions. So.
Kurt Geisert, Association of German SMEs. I have a question for Commissioner Thyssen. You mentioned that you are in favor of a European finance minister, and I totally agree with you, but is this not a long-term perspective given the fact that it will require a change of the European treaties, which again require unanimity among member states? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Benson from the MNRC. I was the guy who applauded. Okay, I'm feeling uncomfortable again when I see this title. I'm wondering what's going to be the concrete impact of today's discussions beyond intellectual entertainment. Because we have been discussing inequalities, unfairness for goodness knows how many years, and I wouldn't say that the situation worldwide is all that conclusive. I mean, people often see problems coming, and once they are there, all they can do is whine because no one knows what to do. So it raises the basic issue of trust, and this comes to my question. Something that I often say, and that is there is a terrible world existential and trust crisis. Citizens don't believe in institutions and policymakers anymore. Suspicion prevails and trust is lost. And without trust, any policy shall fail, whatever the political program anywhere in the world. So to my mind, once again, I think the top priority is to overcome this prevailing suspicion and recover the citizens' trust and respect. How?
Hello, I'm Brennan. I work at Bruegel, but I have a second amateur job on youth employment rights with a little NGO that I run here. And I have two closely related questions. For the trade unions, what do you think you need to do to get young people across Europe to actually understand the importance of trade unions, get them involved? Because in lots of countries where, and we're not just talking social dialogue here, we're talking really collective bargaining, is being eroded. I think lots of young people don't realize what a problem that is. So I'd like to hear a bit about what trade unions are thinking on that. One comment I'd make there is I think that trade unions for too long ignored the issue of internships. And I think they're beginning to wake up to that, which I'm very excited about. A very related question, quite a specific one for the Commissioner. What do you feel about unpaid internships inside EU institutions?
Hello. Gerhard Stahl, Peking University in the College of Europe and former EU civil servant. My question, I have one question to Reiner Hoffmann and one question to the Commissioner. Reiner Hoffmann mentioned very well the conditions for a successful monetary union. And you mentioned harmonization of taxation, and also you mentioned the challenge for the trade unions to coordinate wage policy. And the German trade unions, but you know it better than everybody here, have been very responsible in their wage policy, also allowing Germany to overcome the competitive crisis after unification. One element maybe of this responsible approach was also that there is this Mitbestimmung, this co-decision, which makes German trade unions not only wage partners, but also partners in investing in companies. My question is there any chance that this element of the German trade union system, that means that unions can be part in the company and in the advisory and even in the decision-making parts of the company to decide about investment, that this best practice can be shared with other unions and also with other member states? And then my question to the Commissioner. The Commission has established a lot of specific recommendations in the country-specific recommendations. Wouldn't it be interesting also to recommend this best practice of the German system to other countries to enable that there will be a real social dialogue and that this responsible policy between the employers and the employees and their representatives can be further developed. Because I remember I have read so many political recommendations in the country-specific guidelines, but I have not seen so much emphasizing the importance of the Mitbestimmung, the co-decision process.
Can I ask a question here?
There's also the gentleman at the back who's holding the mic.
I don't need a microphone. Thank you. I had a question concerning the debate around minimum wages and working conditions. Is it, I mean, if you talk about structural determinants, is it not time that we invest more in research and science and innovation if we come to the new EU budget to make sure that actually Europe is investing in high-quality jobs where companies can pay decent wages for decent work? And in this context, I would like to ask the panel, what do you think about a European label for companies who commit to pay a living wage? Because we see more and more companies who pay minimum wages, but very few companies who can commit to pay a fair and decent living wage. Is it not time to have, if the Commission cannot adopt mandatory measures, that they issue a European label for companies who pay living wages? Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, the light is too strong in my eye. I didn't notice you, so of course you can also take the floor.
Thank you. Now I got the microphone again. Till Kupfer from BT. I have a question also because it was addressed the question about the widening income gaps and also precarious typical worker situation. And one issue is also the decline of bargaining powers of trade unions. There was a recent, earlier this week, a piece also in the FT by the former US Treasury saying that America needs trade unions more than ever. And I think some of this also applies to Europe. And if you look at digitization, that will also, despite all its benefits, will also further the decline of the bargaining power because workers can be replaced by machines, but also looking at a shared economy, people become also in certain forms of independence working situations. So my question is also to Reiner Hoffmann in that respect is, I mean, how are the trade unions thinking about this, about how the changing working environment and also the bargaining situation of employees will be addressed in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we take a very last one from here, and then I give the floor to the three panelists.
Thank you. Thomas Schneider, European Association for Managers of the Energy Sector. I have one question referring to all the panelists. In the wake of the financial crisis and the globalization, the concept of an unconditional basic income gained ground, and several pilot projects are now underway in Europe, among others in Finland, governed and under the auspices of the former European Commissioner. My interest in the question is, what are your positions on this concept? Unconditional basic income.
Yes, so we have a huge number of questions from EU finance minister to trust, to trade unions, young people, country-specific recommendations, minimum wages, working conditions, basic income, bargaining, and so on. So I will ask all three of you to respond. Maybe we go in a reverse order, so ask with Nathalie. But Nathalie, let me also have one specific question to you, because you also mentioned that European regulations can help to create frameworks for the industry to better prosper. And I would also wonder if you can mention a few concrete examples where you think that the European framework would be helpful.
Thank you very much, Zsolt. Yeah, so I wanted to answer the SME question first. I think it's been proven that SMEs, the existence of SMEs and employment are very closely linked, because if you are able to develop, grow, and even start SMEs, employment in those smaller companies is extremely high. And I really think that in Europe, there is a lot of attention politically since many, many years, since I did my unpaid stage in 1995 in the Commission and the SME Directorate, which no longer exists. There's always been a lot of attention to SMEs, but I really think there have been lots of measures, and we're very good in Europe at putting a lot of money in research. We kind of distract ourselves in the follow-up of those research products that maybe start in an SME in terms of getting that product to the market and allowing the SME to get a return on investment and grow. And so when you talk about policies to facilitate, it wasn't really for industrial growth, it was more policies to facilitate equality. I think we need to think about what we're good at doing, what we've done well, and when we do reviews of incentives or other things, think about, okay, what am I putting at risk? Not only what am I trying to fix, but what am I putting at risk? Because sometimes we just want to change. And we also need to stop and analyze what has been achieved. So I would say attention to SMEs, making sure that we're not only good at funding them, but also following them through so that they can get their products onto the market, make that return on investment and grow. Because certainly in the area of pharmaceutical SMEs, we have the same number of SMEs as in the US. The size is 10 times smaller in terms of employment. Because they are small, they stay small, they don't grow. They get bought up by the big ones or they have corporations with the big ones, but they could never face the regulatory environment that there is in Europe. So we need to, and maybe with a series of incentives they could. Do you see what I mean? So I think there's more food for thought in terms of sustaining not only the number, but also the size of our SMEs in terms of employment then and capacity to do that. Your question on regulations, yeah. So the question on legislation for me was more those two examples I gave. So the orphan medicinal product regulation in 2000, the capacity to, through incentives to industry, to address these unmet medical needs that were extremely cumbersome and chronic and debilitating for children and then families, carers who stay at home. That enabled industry to get into that field and then develop 132 products in 17 years, knowing that a product takes 15 years to develop. So everybody, as soon as the regulation came out in 2000, started investing. Because if we're seeing products now, it means that they started investing as soon as the regulation. So it was an immediate effect. And that's for me, that's very impressive in this area. The same for pediatrics. It's a requirement. It has incentives, but it has yielded a result. So I think there are ways to shepherd, in some cases, legislation at EU level that can help address inequalities.
Before I come to some of the questions, only one additional piece of information concerning what Nathalie said. In Germany, the situation is that low-wage earners have 10 years lower life expectancy than the rich people. This is a figure which has been published just a couple of months ago. 10 years lower life expectation for low-wage earners. This has nothing to do with what we are calling soziale Marktwirtschaft. There are a number of very good but not easy questions. And to be quite frank, the question, what have trade unions to do to strengthen collective bargaining systems? It's to some extent indeed our task. And we as trade unions are member organizations. In difference to political parties have to win elections. As trade unions, as member organizations, I must be able to mobilize and, if necessary, to went on strike. If I don't have the capacity to went on strike, the employers will voluntarily certainly not follow our demands. So, membership for trade unions is one of the key. And we have lost members, there is nothing to hide, there is a weakness, we have to regain our strength again. But there is also the possibility for governments, and to some extent I can imagine also for the European Commission, to strengthen collective bargaining systems via what we are calling Allgemeinverbindlichkeitserklärungen, general purpose declarations, or to strengthen the erga omnes clauses. That those agreements are not only binding for companies which are member in an employer organization, that also companies which are not in an employer organization have to address the rules of the collective agreements. This is a very easy thing to do. We have made some progress in Germany, but this went not far enough. On collective bargaining, especially under the circumstances of the monetary union, we have been very well aware, if we like to avoid wage competition in a monetary union, trade unions have to coordinate their collective bargaining policies much stronger in the past. It's easy to say, and I've been working 16 years for the European Trade Union Confederation, and we're making a lot of efforts to strengthen the coordination, but the coordination or the collective bargaining systems are so different, and mainly agreements are negotiated at the sectorial level. But we have also the situation that more and more agreements are negotiated at the company level. And I can tell you that I have, even in Germany, problems as a DGB to coordinate my 8 organizations to have a coordinated bargaining approach. This is really quite ambitious, but we have to strengthen this as no doubt also as a response to make the monetary union a success. The question on participation and co-determination, I think this is indeed the strength in Germany, that we are not only relatively strong over the last 5, 6, 7 years again in negotiating wage increases, that with the specific situation of co-determination in Germany, we have indeed to some extent an influence in company strategies and also in investment policies of companies. But this is not unique the case in Germany. Most of the people don't know that we have, out of the at now 28 member states, 18 member states in Europe which have co-determination systems where workers have a word to say in company policies. There are different, but the system, or it is not only a specific German approach. And one of the big risks we are facing, unfortunately, is coming from Europe. Because via European corporation law, via European company law, national co-determination systems are at risk that they try to circumvent the obligations for participation rights of workers via choosing European company law like the SE, the Societas Europaeenne, or others, where we had just a case at the European Court of Justice, where the European Court of Justice confirmed, also with the political support of the Commission, I have to say, support that co-determination in Germany as elsewhere in Europe are not against competition rules in Europe. But it's quite complex and it's quite difficult. On minimum wages, perhaps a last sentence, also in reflecting that we have differences in the participation systems, workers' participation systems in Europe. And there has been, until the 90s, also an ideological struggle between the trade unions in Europe. But this has been overcome. And we are looking now to have at least some sort of ceiling on European co-determination rights for workers, which is a clear demand from the European Trade Union Confederation, especially vis-à-vis the developments on corporation law in European corporation law, company law. Minimum wages, I would be very happy if we don't need them. But the condition, the precondition would be that our collective bargaining systems are working. This was the response of the Agenda 2010 policy, the labor markets reforms in Germany, that afterwards, we have been quite skeptical at the beginning, but afterwards, having experienced the increase of the low-wage sector, 22%, that we saw that we need a minimum wage to introduce, if we don't like to continue with the downward spiral for workers in their income. It's a different concept than living wages, and also this we have been discussed at the ETUC. And I think we need some joint crash barriers in Europe on living wages, and which has to be related on the economic performance of the member states. It will not be the same for every member state, this is for sure, but I think we need such crash borders also as a response towards the increase in inequality. I stop here because I can't respond to all questions.
Thank you. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I had many questions. I tried to answer them all. If I failed, please remind me what I did not answer. First of all, on the European budget, well, I am in favor of an own budget that you can use for many things where you need European decision-making, and by preference, of course, on the communitarian method. I see my old colleague Pervenche here in the room, and I think we cannot more agree on that. What specific institutions you need, we have to develop that, but I can say this is under preparation. Deepening of the EMU is something that is on the agenda. Trust. People don't trust institutions anymore, politicians, not politicians, and other institutions. That's what we see, trust is going down. What I also discovered when looking and following every year again, and all these kinds of statistics about this, is that it goes closely together with the economic conjuncture. If it's going better economically, there is more trust among people in the institutions, also in the political institutions. If it's going badly, trust is going down. So I think, what do we need to regain trust? Yeah, to do our job in a proper way, everybody of us, of course, but also to make sure that we have results, and that results are felt by the people, that they see that we are working for them. Also at European level, that they feel that citizens is what Europe is about. And then we will have trust again, not by nice words and nice speeches. It is about results. This is what people expect from us, not less. And this is why we have to work for. In unpaid internship, well, if I was an intern in the European Union, of course I would say I want to have it paid. But this is now the system. It depends on what and how long. I cannot say in general that when it is unpaid, it's bad and so on. If it's about short-term internships where young people can really learn something extra, I think it's better to have it than not to have it. And this is what I see in the Commission. Those who are there, they are really learning. They have a learning curve. And it is short internship. It's not for a very long term. What do we have more? Yes, on mitbestimming, don't we have to make a CSR on that and to push member states or social partners in member states to go to that direction and to look at a good example in Germany and to use it to replicate it? I think this must be part of the culture. We can show it, we can talk about it, and I'm sure this is done. But if it's not in the culture of a member state, you cannot just say, especially not from the European side, and now you're going to work in this way. I think this will not be accepted and will not work also. So I think we can show the good elements of it, and there are many good elements of this, show the results, the success stories, tell about the success stories, but really I think we cannot exaggerate, because it can have a contra effect also. It is like dual learning and apprentices. We see in Germany, in Switzerland even, how it works, and that this is really a good way for professional education, for training and so on. And then we can show it and say, yeah, dual learning, good there for that, and so, but we cannot just say, now take it, because it must be in the culture also. Then it's about economy, it must be in the culture to really work well. There must both parts that really want to do it, they must accept it. Then we had the question on, what about the European label for enterprises that have fair working conditions or good wages. I think here this is difficult also to do it from European level. Because you first need a definition. What is a fair wage? You must control, inspect, follow up, and so on and so on. So I think there it can be a nice idea to let member states and organizations work together, but I think this is not something that we should do from a European level. Then what do we think about the income, a basic income? We from the Commission are not. We don't have it on our agenda, so we will not come with a proposal to member states' recommendation or directive about basic income. We are in favor, and this is several times repeated even by the President of the Commission, in favor of a minimum income and in favor of minimum wages. We need social partner for that. When it's about wages, we don't have the competence. Also minimum income, it's not up to Europe. There is also competence in the hands of member states, regions often, but we stimulate it because we think it would be good to have in every member state minimum wage, minimum income, and not just a minimum wage because it can be so low, or a minimum income that it's far under the poverty threshold even. It must be a decent minimum income and a good minimum wage. But we have to leave it in the hands of those who are competent to have it. On a minimum income, I know that there is an experiment going in Finland, ongoing, and we watch it. We look what will be the results on that. And of course, we have an open mind in the Commission, so if we can learn something from that, we will not hesitate to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner. And my very last job is to thank all three of you for sharing your time with us, for sharing your thoughts with us, for trying to answer all of the questions which was raised by the audience. I would also like to thank you for your participation and the questions to raise. I very much enjoyed the discussion. And my last announcement is that there will be a lunch. And the lunch room, Foyer Marguerite, is a very special room because there is fantastic paintings there. So while you enjoy the lunch, also please take a look at the paintings. So thanks again for participating.